The first time I used a Macintosh in a professional capacity was 2020. For the first 2 decades of my life, I exclusively worked in Windows, with a few computers in my house running Linux with the XFCE interface. Now, Mac OS X, when I first used it, seemed weird, clunky, unintuitive. Everyone I knew who was a Mac diehard swore that it was the easiest interface, but I just could not understand why it was set up the way that it was. And I still couldn't for several years. Now, this machine is currently running OpenBSD. When I first got my iMac, it came to me running OS 9. And that was my first foray into classic Mac OS, an operating system that most people my age and younger have never used and might not even know exists. But when I did a deep dive into the system and I began to understand why it was set up the way that it was, I began to understand a paradigm of computer interface design that I'd never seen before, and I genuinely think we might have lost something. If you'll come with me, I will take you through OS 9, I'll explain a little bit about how it works, why it was put together, and I'll share some other opinions on the matter from other people who have been opinionated on this subject for longer than I've been alive. Now, if you're new to this channel, I am going to try to make more videos like this in the future. I've got lots of different topics that I talk about. I'm still moving in, so my desk might look a little nicer in the future. We'll have plenty of toys to play with. I would really appreciate if you would like and subscribe. And of course, if you have any ideas for future videos, or you have any comments on this video, please feel free to let me know. I'll make sure to take a look at those. Fortunately, if you can see the cursor on this, of course, I actually have a version of Mac OS 9 running inside a virtual machine. And if any of you guys would like to follow along from home, it is completely effortless to get Mac OS 9 installed on any kind of computer, regardless of your operating system. Now, at first, this desktop might seem a little bit innocuous, but there are a lot of secrets hiding under the surface. First and foremost, on Windows or on Linux, your desktop is a folder in and of itself. On Windows, you can drill down into your user directory and you will find a desktop folder. The same can be said for Mac OS X. That is not the case on classic Mac OS. Your desktop is not a folder, but rather a representation of areas in which you can drill down. When you plug a device into your computer, for example, my virtual machine has Microsoft Office 2001 as a disk image. This is a visual representation of those different drives and devices. If you put a program or a file or a folder on the desktop, it's not truly on the desktop, but it's almost as if you are mounting it like a disk. It's very strange. Now, much like with modern Mac OS, the reason why you distribute programs as a .dmg file in Mac OS X is because they wanted to sort of emulate the installation process from classic Mac OS. If you notice, I'll open up this folder and it's got some instructions here. If this is just a folder though, then why do we have text over here? Well, you see, you are now being introduced to classic Finder. Unlike any modern operating system, with a couple of application-specific exceptions that you can enable on certain Linux distributions, classic Mac OS uses a spatial file system. Now, you have to understand, you'll want to get into the perspective of people who were working on this in the 1980s. Nowadays, if you are wanting to design a desktop environment from pure cloth, so to speak, you would be coming into it with 30 years worth of development experience before you that you might have taken for granted. Keep in mind that the desktop analogy, so to speak, was an innovation of Xerox PARC in the late 70s. No one had thought to do anything like what they were doing before then. Because remember, a computer is just a collection of bytes in memory in a two-dimensional plane that your processor executes one at a time. A Turing machine, which is what all computers fundamentally are, it's just a string of tape with a read head, and the tape tells the read head where to move. So there's nothing connecting that concept to a desktop. What the Macintosh team set out to do is they wanted to make everything your computer can do accessible through an explicit visual metaphor. You might think this is what Windows does, but it's not quite. What macOS is doing here is it's acting as if your files are physical objects that can be placed in a certain location and will stay there. Let's say I'll go to my hard drive. If you have multiple hard drives plugged into your computer, and I have tried this out, they appear as different icons. Let's say I want to move the documents folder right here, sort of spatially underneath all the other icons. I'll close this window, and I'll reopen this, and you'll notice it stays exactly where I put it. And if I resize this, it doesn't change the orientation of the icons. Now this is where macOS Finder severely differs from later incarnations of the Finder or anything else. You'll notice there are no toolbars. There's a little bit of information about the folder itself, but there are no inherent toolbars. There's no copy, no paste, no nothing. When I open a new folder, it opens as a new window. And I can continue to drill down into this, and as I do so, it creates new windows, which I can then move around. Now, this seems like it gets really messy really fast. And people who are coming in from a Windows background might look on this system with a certain level of disgust. Just because it seems like your desktop would get really cluttered. But the secret of classic macOS is that that's actually by design. You see, classic macOS, the first few versions of the operating system, could only open one program at a time. Whatever floppy disk you had stuck into the front of your Macintosh was the only program that would be running on your Macintosh. There isn't necessarily a set of shared system libraries in the same way there is with modern GNU-based Linux machines. What the Macintosh had was a toolbox. And the whole idea was that your operating system, your macOS, was not designed to be a facilitating platform through which you would hop into different windows, so to speak, but rather the context through which the program would take over the computer. Because keep in mind, system resources were pretty small back then, and having a GUI at all would consume all of your system resources. It was only with the introduction of Multi-Finder, which you can still see tenets of in macOS 9 here at the top right corner, in which you could run multiple programs. But if the only thing running on your computer at that time was the Finder, then you would be 100% fine with it taking up your entire desktop. They wanted that clutter to be there because they thought that the more the system represented something physical, like the actual files on your desk, like your physical desk, then the easier it would be for people to intuit what they need to be doing. If I think the words of John Syracuse, who we'll get to in a little bit, if your computer is cluttered, your mind does not have to be. This is why, and part of this is due to just the way it was designed. If you wanted to install a program, you would literally just open up the disk that had the program, and then open up your hard drive, and then you could just drag the folder. I've already installed this, so I'm not going to do it, but you could just drag the folder over into the hard drive. There was no sort of convoluted process through which you would move to do steps in your computer. Everything on macOS 9 is exactly what it seems like it is. We go up to the Apple menu here at the top, and you'll notice that we've got sort of an arbitrary list of applications. These are not, this is not an automatically populated list of applications. This is actually a representation of a folder on your hard drive. We can go to your system folder, if it'll open, and we'll go to Apple menu items, and these right here are the physical items inside a folder that represent the Apple menu items. I understand the start menu is this way as well, where it has a folder where it represents some of the items in your start menu, but more or less that is not consistent behavior across Windows. while on Apple, that is 100% consistent behavior. You see this little toolbar sort of thing at the bottom of the screen with little sort of widget programs you can use to either adjust your volume or to connect to different things on QuickTime. Those are within a folder as well. Everything is 100% consistent. In fact, Mac OS 9 is actually pretty unique in that all of the system files don't even necessarily need to be on your hard drive. You can actually boot up a macOS system disk from your disk drive, and it will operate in much the same way as a read-only hard drive would. On Linux, when you boot into a live system, it's not quite running 100% the same way that it would on a hard drive. It has sort of a flattened, expanded RAM disk that it then loads everything in from. In fact, you have to kind of, in some way, honor the simplicity of the system. There is no dynamic RAM allocation. Every program has to explicitly state how much RAM they're going to take up, and that's how much Multifinder gives them. Like I said, there is no installation process. You just drag things over into your hard drive. Driver installation is a piece of cake, and not because the interface necessarily makes it a piece of cake, but because the interface is a one-to-one representation of what the system is doing, and the system just lets you drag binaries wherever you want. In fact, this really is, to some degree, the purest desktop operating system I've ever seen. I would love to see a modern implementation of a system that ran on the same principles as classic macOS. Not because I think it's the right way to run a reliable system, because it's not. This thing crashes all the time, but rather because there are some unique speed benefits to running this way, as well as a unique paradigm shift in the way you tend to use your computer. Now let's take a look at what I mean by this operating system is designed to run one program at a time. Using multiple programs is the exception. Obviously, if you haven't noticed, when you open multiple programs, there is no taskbar. One second, let me put this information in real quick. Something I thought was always fascinating about classic macOS is that because the system was only designed to be useful with one application at a time, Windows tend to take on a very different attitude. They spread themselves out all over the system. For example, you'll notice that with Microsoft Word, which is a Microsoft application, it's trying to be at home on macOS, but it doesn't have to be. I've got 4 different windows that have opened up. I've got this toolbar that's just floating over here. I've got this content panel. I've got this little, I think he's called like Mackie or something, but he's sort of our version of Clippy. And I've got this formatting palette, and they're all sort of just all over the place. Now, when I move back to Finder, though, everything but the content pane disappears. The idea being, individual applications feel free to sort of stretch out. They don't feel like they have to be limited to the borders of any individual window. This is a system that gives every application the right to be the only thing on the system. And so therefore, it takes full advantage of everything. It takes over the toolbar at the top of the screen. It takes over... It just has its way with everything, And you can see this sort of behavior on modern macOS just a little bit. But it is kind of sad that Microsoft Word and even the built-in Apple programs don't take advantage of your system in this way. In fact, they've kind of gone down the iPhone route. Now, what's interesting about iPhone is that it is also a system in which it expects only one application to be useful at any given time. And so it doesn't have a taskbar for you to select applications from. You have to use a way to switch applications that isn't obvious. It expects you to go back to the home screen every time you want to do anything. But it does handle this in quite a different way. Because its screen is so much smaller, and because you're using your finger and not a pointing device, the iPhone takes this... It takes the sort of window constraints that the Microsoft Windows operating system has, and it blows it up such that it fills up the whole screen. And this paradigm has taken over design entirely. You see it all over the web. You see it on the new slew of updated macOS applications. You can even see it something that Microsoft's been trying to pull off themselves since Windows 8, to varying degrees of success. So I actually recommend checking out this article if you haven't. I'm going to leave the link to this in the description. A lot of the ideas I expressed here are sort of expressed in a little bit of a different tone. But what's really cool is that I actually sent an email to this man, John Syracuse, and obviously I can't show you the email, but I can read his response on it. I asked him what his thoughts were 20 years later on the current state of macOS X in relation to the thoughts he had on macOS 9. And here's what he says. Compared to macOS X, the first two versions, not much has changed UI-wise. The macOS Finder still doesn't separate its browser windows from its spatial windows, so maintaining spatial state is still very difficult. There also hasn't been much innovation in the spatial or browser sides of the Finder UI. Shoebox apps seem to be the norm now, apps that have and maintain their own library of data that the user interacts with solely through the app. And document-based apps seem to be pushing users towards saving their files in a flat or shallow hierarchy in cloud storage rather than on local disks. I think that part of what has driven UI over the past 10 years has been a push towards silos, in which all of your data is owned by a particular company that only allows you to access your data through their software or through their particular suite of software applications. Now, this kind of reminds me of the way that computers used to work back in the late 70s, early 80s, in the era of Commodore and Atari and early Apple. Every time a new computer came out, it would run an entirely different chipset architecture with its own custom-built operating system that would likely never receive any updates, with its own set of software that had to be specifically compiled for that machine, oftentimes with its own unique file system, its own unique file formats. It used to be a really big deal to exchange data between two computers. Instead of the limitations being technical, though, they are very much arbitrary, top-down driven. There is no reason why my thermostat can't open a Word document. And in part, I believe that this change has actually been due to the open source community in some ways. As I was editing, I realized I did a pretty bad job of explaining why I was blaming the open source community for this particular paradigm shift. Let me explain. The open source community has broken down every single barrier that exists when it comes to getting software on a machine. I mean, look at it. This right here is running OpenBSD 6, and it's as old as I am. And it's running an architecture that hasn't been manufactured in, like, what, 20 years? I mean, PowerPC still exists, but this is the 32-bit variety. This is a G3 processor, you know? And because of that, companies no longer have any excuses. They can pull their libraries, they can pull their protocols, the libraries that communicate those protocols for free, open source. There's no reason not to use .json for data serialization. There's no reason not to use PNG for images. There's no reason not to use these open file systems or, you know, network sharing protocols because the engineering's all done for you. Well, then what is a proprietary company supposed to do if everything that builds their app is essentially handed to them with a catch, that being the GNU public license? Well, what they do if they want to save money and keep their rights to their own stuff, they build walled gardens. So these walled gardens are the only option these companies have. We've almost checkmated them. But they decided to essentially bluff, and this is where we are now. Now, do I think that the open source community is going to be able to come up with a solution to this problem? Of course I do. But I'm only saying that because I think that what the open source community has done is phenomenal, and that we are seeing here is not a negative consequence of what we've done, but rather a defense mechanism on the part of these companies. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks. I don't know. I've just become very fond of using macOS 9 as sort of a toy operating system at this point. and as a piece of history and a reflection point that helped set my priorities when I value desktop environments going forward. But anyway, what are your thoughts? Do you have any memories using Mac OS 9? Do you think that this is all pretentious and bogus? If so, make sure to let me know. Anyway, I appreciate you guys. Hopefully in the future I'll be able to get to some more interesting topics. But until next time, peace.